Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, we're going to use this beautiful garden roses set, and I have the stamp, the stencil, and the die. They all coordinate together, and we're going to create a rainbow roses gatefold card. Now, the first thing we're going to do is use the layering stencils, and we're going to create our image. I'm choosing to do the stencils before stamping, but you could always stamp your image and then use your stencils to color them in. I have 3 different shades of each color. I chose to do these rainbow or these roses rainbow hue, just something a little bit different, something a little bit unique and interesting. So I'm going to do one of each of the colors of rainbows. I've got some yellow shades, pink shades, orange shades, purples, and blues, and then I'm going to do the greenery in, obviously, the greens. So I'm going and doing one of each of the roses. There is going to be 2 little yellow buds, and I did the buds yellow because it's my least favorite color. So I'm just making sure to color the full area of the opening of the stencil for this particular one. This is the first stencil, and they all have, it says right at the top corner, layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, so it makes it very easy to know exactly which layer is next, and it avoids any guessing. I'm using a different colored blending brush for each of the colors just so that I don't contaminate any of my colors. Now, obviously, coloring this image would be a lot quicker if all the roses were all the same color, so that's definitely an option. But this is just something a little bit different, something that I haven't done before, and I just thought it would be a little bit fun. As I mentioned before, I have 3 different shades of each of the colors. If you don't happen to have 3 different shades of whatever colors you're wanting to use, you could do the first layer as a really, really light coat and then go a little bit heavier as you continue. Or if you only have 2 different colors, light coat with one, dark coat with another. There are ways to work around it if you don't happen to have 3 different shades of the same color or similar colors, but it does make it a little bit easier if you have 3 different ink pads. But just know that you don't necessarily have to have it in order to make this technique work. You can, like I said, light-handed with one color, dark-handed with the second layer or the third layer, whatever you want, just to make it work for you. And you could also blend different colors together to get some more unique shading. I'm trying to make each of these layers a little bit darker than the next. And I'm just kind of doing an even coat of all of the colors. Often when I'm using stencils, I'll try to make it lighter towards the outside of the flower or in different areas and darker in other areas. But for this one, I'm just trying to do an even coat. I will go with, and I do the greens and make the lightest coat a little bit darker towards the base of the stem and the base of the leaves. But for the flowers, I'm just kind of doing an even coat. There's a small enough area for each one of them that it's a little bit harder to make darker areas and lighter areas, and I don't think you'd really see it with this image. Now, these images for these stencils have register marks to make it really easy to place them on 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch pieces of cardstock. I chose to do bigger sheets of cardstock for this one just because I wanted to make sure that I had space to do the die cutting around. And sometimes these images are so big that it's hard to get them placed perfectly on a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of cardstock, and make sure that you have enough room for the die cutting. Those extra cardstock pieces aren't going to go to waste. I'll use them to die cut some extra layers just to give my image pieces a little bit more stability, a little bit more thickness, and a little bit more substance. So for this particular stencil, I am lining up the top left corner of the stencil with the top left corner of my cardstock. I figured that would be a good way to make sure everything lined up. However, the second layer of the stencil didn't line up exactly correctly on my left hand side piece there. So for the subsequent layers, I'm just making sure that they line up perfectly. It's not going to make any difference for the design that I want to create in the end, but just be aware that sometimes if you line them up in the corner, it doesn't actually line up the image piece perfectly. It was news to me. I assumed that it was going to work until I did that second layer. You never know when something that you assume is going to teach you something. I do, however, love the fact that there are layering stencils to color in images, especially when you're not necessarily in the mood to color. I typically love coloring, but there's just some times where you want to create something, but you don't really want to do a lot of thinking or you just want something to come together quite quickly. And these layering stencils are absolutely perfect for that. So I really do love them for that fact, the fact that you can color an image very, very quickly and end up creating something very quickly. And they always look really beautiful. So now we're to our leaves of the image. And like I said before, for the lightest color of the leaves, I'm being fairly light-handed over the whole thing, but then where the leaf goes behind the rose or whatnot, I do add a little bit more color just to add a little bit of natural shading to it. This particular stencil set, there's only 2 layers for the leaves. There's 3 layers for the roses, 2 layers for the leaves. So I only have 2 different green colors here, but they look absolutely beautiful when they're done. Now I am going to use the coordinating die for this particular card, or these particular cards that I'm making, because I'm making 2, but you definitely don't have to. You could do this image and have it as the focal point of your card and not need to die cut it. So you don't necessarily need the die to go with it. I just love having all the options. The other thing is you could stencil and not stamp the outline image if you want. Again, I like having all the options for future projects, but it's definitely not a requirement to have all of the things within the coordinated line. I do love the fact that you can pick and choose everything that you want and that you can customize it to what you like to do and not necessarily buy a whole line and have to have the stencil, the die, the stamp all together. So I decided I wanted to add a little bit of shimmer to part of the image. So I'm taking a little mini mister here. I've got some water in it. I filled it up to the top, and then I'm going to take some Perfect Pearls. The nice thing about Perfect Pearls is it has a binding agent in it that it's activated by water. So when you put it into the water and you create your own shimmer spray with it, you know that once you spray it onto your card, onto your project or whatnot, once that spray is dry, it's not going to smear around. That binding agent makes everything sealed all within there. So it's a really nice thing to use. And the nice thing with Perfect Pearls is you can customize it to whatever project you're working on. You could use colored Perfect Pearls. You could also use distress re-inkers to color it, to make a colored shimmer spray. So I'm just lining up the 3rd stencil for the roses there. I'm just holding it in place while I spray it, and then I'm lifting it up. I don't want to make sure that that water doesn't seep underneath there while it's sitting. And then I'm going to let that dry completely. Once it's dry completely, I'm going to line up my stamp with the image. I'm going to do one of my images with stamping and embossing, and I'm going to do my other one with just a black outline. I'm going to do the stamping and embossing first. I haven't used this particular stamp with the stencil, so I wanted to test it and see if I could line it up properly. And for the first image, I actually did not have it lined up, so I wanted to show you how I fixed that. The Versamark ink that I use is not going to show up on the white cardstock very well, so I just brushed off that embossing powder. Take an embossing powder tool on my image to soak up any excess moisture that is there from the Versamark ink. I cleaned my stamp really, really well so that I don't have any ink residue on it. I'm going to reline it up. For the second card, I'll show you how I do it in a bit of a different way with colored ink. And it's a great way to make sure to line up your images perfectly. This second one, I did have it lined up correctly. I find sometimes though with clear stamps, even though they're clear and you can see through them, sometimes with outlines, it's hard to see exactly where that outline is going. So if you have trouble with it, this is a little trick here. I have a piece of acetate. This is one that is stained and discolored, so I'm not going to be using it for a craft project. I'm taking my stamp with some archival ink. I know it's going to stick on that acetate, but it's not going to dry up really quickly. So it's going to help me test exactly where that stamped image is going. I can clean it off if I need to test it again, and I did need to test it again, and I lined it up perfectly the second time. But it's a great way to see exactly where that lined image is going to go without actually stamping your project. So you can make sure that everything's lined up perfectly and not have to possibly ruin your project by mislining up a stamp. Once that's done, I'm going to cut it out on my Big Shot machine. I've got both of those. I've cut them out. And then I'm going to create some sentiments for our cards. I'm going to use another stamp and die set from Pink Fresh Studios. This one is called Perfect Sentiments. It's a great way to create a lot of sentiments at one time. I have a half a sheet of cardstock in my Misty here, and I'm going to stamp the image with black. I'm going to do two sets of sentiments, one that's stamped in black and one that is embossed with silver embossing powder to coordinate with the two different images that I want or that I have created with the roses. So my stamped ones are really, really easy. I just use some black distress ink and stamped them. I actually stamped them twice to make sure I have a nice crisp image. For the Versamark ones, I'm stamping it once again in my Misty stamping tool. It's perfect to do in the Misty stamping tool just because if you happen to not get a clear image, you could stamp it again and know that it's in exactly the right spot. Then I'm putting my embossing powder on top of that and using my embossing tool to melt them. The next step is just to line up the die, and I love how the die is in one piece, so you can cut up a whole bunch of the sentiments all at one time with one single die. I'm going to tape it in place really, really well. I want to make sure that it doesn't shift in my machine. I did find it shifted a little bit because I placed my cardstock on top of my die. I think it might move it down a little bit, but for the second one, I placed it the other way where I have the cardstock down and the die on top of it, and it ended up shifting a lot less. So just play around with your dies. If you happen to find that they're shifting in the machine, just play around with your placing and tape it on there really, really well to help prevent that. Now that that first set of sentiments is done, I can repeat that process for the second set, and then I can pick and choose what sentiments I want for the cards I'm making today. Anything extra is going to go into a container that I can pick and choose sentiments for future projects. I love having a container of excess sentiments that I can pick out in a pinch. Off camera, I took some of the excess cardstock and cut some extra layers. I did 2 extras of each one of these to make the pieces a little bit more substantial. We're creating some gatefold cards, and I want to have some areas that can kind of lock in place to hold it closed. Now, I did 2 extra die cuts for this. In the end, I would prefer if I had only done 1 extra die cut so it was thicker, but not quite as thick. And I'll show you why in a little bit. But they were already glued together when I discovered that they're a little bit too thick. So here I've got the first one done. I did this one off screen just to make sure it was going to work. And you can see how those die cuts are so thick that they poke out a little bit. And I think if there was only 1 extra die cut put on there, that would eliminate that. I have a piece of cardstock here that is 4 inches by 5 1/4, and I'm just going to stamp and emboss a script stamp on the back, just a little bit of patterned texture on the back of the cardstock. It's going to coordinate with the silver embossing for both the sentiment and the image. I did this as one piece, and then I'm going to cut it down and I'm going to put it on the card base. That way I know that my pattern is going to line up. I have a piece of cardstock here for the card base. It is 5 1/2 by 8 1/2, and I'm scoring at 2 1/8 of an inch. My score pal has a mark where the 2 1/8 of an inch is, so it makes it really, really easy to score. Once that's done, we're going to fold them to the center, and I'm using my Teflon bone folder to really make sure to press those folds in place and get a nice crisp line there. Once that's done, I can take the piece of black that I had stamped and embossed, and I'm going to cut it in the center. I'm creating a finished card that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And this piece here being 4 inches by 5 1/4, I'm going to have a nice border around the whole outside, and I'm going to make them match in the center as if it was one piece, but there's obviously the cut. This way, when the card is completely closed, it looks like one full piece. Once that glue has dried on that background piece, I'm going to glue down my roses. Now, I only want to glue down the roses on the left-hand side of the card. I don't want any glue on the right-hand side of the die cut, or I would be gluing my card closed. So I lay it down there first to make sure I know how far to put the glue, and then I kind of put my fingers where I want the glue to end, just to kind of give myself an indication. I'm going to do the same thing for the sentiment, and in between putting the different die cuts down, I do put a acrylic block on there plus a container of glass beads just to hold it down till that glue is completely dried. While I'm waiting for my first card to completely dry, I did put some stickles around the edges of the petals just to give it a little bit of extra sparkle. Once everything is dried, I can put my card together by tucking the leaves from my roses die cut behind the sentiment. Gatefold cards are a really easy way to just change up your card making design by having your card open in an unexpected way. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a fabulous day.